Looking at 9 minutes after 7 o'clock here on Sky 99.5 FM as we settle into our number 2 of the Breakfast Roundtable for today, Monday, 19th February 2018. Want to put the spotlight on a story that has been dominating the headlines for the last week plus. That is the foiled plot to destabilize the country during the Carnival celebrations. And it looks as though there's going to be a legal backlash. A powerful storm of lawsuits against the state by those who would have been detained by police during their investigations and assisting them with their inquiries. To put things in perspective for us, on the line we have with us attorney at law and member of the Police Service Commission, Martin George. Good morning to you, Martin George.
Yeah, hi, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. George.
Good morning to your panel and good morning, Adam Tobago.
There is no way that government can be optimistic about this case. It looks like an open and shut case of you didn't have the legal standing to do what you did, so you better be prepared to pay out a lot of money once these court cases are concluded. Is that it in a nutshell, Martin George?
Well, Jessamy, I am not sure what's the basis for saying that at all. Maybe there's something I'm missing in this entire scenario. So if you can fill me in as to where this is coming from. Well,
basically, it is alleged that, firstly, the police kept those people in their custody beyond what is considered the normal 72-hour period. So several writs of habeas corpus were filed in order to get people released. And then there is also the allegation that they were brought in there and there is no legislation, as it were, supporting the way that they did what they did. And reference was made to anti-gang legislation. But there is an argument that we do have anti-terrorism legislation on the books. It's a little confusing.
Well, I mean, there is anti-terrorism legislation on the books. And the thing is, separate and apart from that, if it is that you are talking about any plot to commit criminal acts which are designed for whatever purpose, whether it is to destabilize the country or for whatever reason, the point is if there is some sort of conspiracy to commit a criminal offense, then you don't even need to go to anything as sophisticated as anti-terrorism legislation or even anti-gang legislation. The point is the conspiracy to commit a crime. That in itself usually is something that you can go to your most basic and fundamental statutes and use that as a basis for a police investigation. So I am a bit perplexed as to find sound footing for this supposed rash of legal actions. The thing is, if it is that the police are holding someone and they can't justify the basis for continuing to hold them and they've gone past what is considered to be a reasonable period, as you mentioned, the 72-hour window, then your primary relief, first and foremost, is your writ of habeas corpus. So if it is that you file your writ of habeas corpus and if it is that it is successful and the court orders that, look, yes, this person is to be released, then that in itself doesn't invalidate the reason for you being arrested in the first place. The thing is, the point is the police may not have gotten the evidence yet to be able to charge you or to lay charges. So their investigation might still be continuing but the point is the court says, if the court grants the relief and the writ of habeas corpus, is that, look, notwithstanding the fact that you have your job to do in terms of investigating this allegation or this complaint, you can't continue to hold this person in custody. So therefore I'm ordering that they be released. So it's two separate things entirely. And, one thing I want us to remember, okay, and I want us to be left with, if nothing else this morning, is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Yes.
So let's
That's
remember
powerful.
that, so in other words, the fact that there may not have been evidence, procured to prove the point doesn't mean
It doesn't
that
exist.
there's none. If you understand,
Absolutely.
none available. So we have to be careful in terms of that. And once the police can justify, because at the end of the day, what the law looks at is the question of how reasonable, rational, and justifiable were your actions. So in other words, if you had credible information from a reputable or reliable source to say, well, look, hey, John Brown, is planning to do this or plotting to do this, whatever, then of course the police have a duty to investigate. And if they think that, look, by bringing that person into custody for questioning, whatever, that will facilitate the investigation, then they would need to justify and show, well, okay, yes, why they felt this was a necessary step. It can't be arbitrary or capricious, and that's what the law guards against. But once you can show that there was some reasonable or rational justification for your action, I can't see the quantum leap to say, well, simply because you were arrested means that you are entitled to an award of damages and a court is going to rule in your favor, because the only way you can justify that is to show that it was an unlawful arrest ab initio.
Mr. George.
The thing is, to make it unlawful, it must be that there was absolutely no reasonable or logical basis whatsoever for the arrest.
Mr. George, beside the possible criminal aspects of the case, could another aspect be the diplomatic aspect, that the government may not want to implicate perhaps the Americans or the Canadians or whoever, as the case might be, because of the diplomacy that's happening at the moment? Because they can simply say the Americans gave us some assistance, as the case might be, and possibly it might be more. But because of the nature of the diplomacy, they may not want to say much more about that.
Well, I would imagine certainly in terms of whether you have certain sources of information. There may be times when you may not wish to reveal all your sources of information.
Yes.
But the thing is, if it comes down to a question of justifying something for a court, then you may very well have to, provide a basis to show that your action was not arbitrary or just random, So it's a fine line you walk in terms of how you guard yourself against overexposure to reveal your sources of information, and how you put forth your evidence to justify the reasonableness of your action in the first place. But again, to the first, opening salvo that you gave Jessime, I am not sure who are the legal experts who have, propounded this idea that, these persons are, set to make some kind of windfall of the state for this action. I am yet to see how they connect the legal dots to come to that conclusion at this stage, because if it were that you had a scenario where the police came forth and confessed, well, look, we really had absolutely no basis for arresting these individuals in the first place, then I could understand someone saying, well, yes, it looks like they may not be able to defend their actions, but I can't seek to prejudge the issue at all, because I don't have all the information, and I don't know if these persons who are speaking with that confidence, if they have some peculiar knowledge that no one else has.
Okay, I want to put a couple other things in the mix. We have been hearing certain narratives coming out of this. One, that a particular group of people is being discriminated against by the state, just as they're being discriminated against in other parts of the world. And the assumption is being made that because you belong to this particular group, that you will be engaging in this particular behavior.
The thing is, I think the acting commissioner gave a statement whereby he debunked that
Absolutely.
idea. And,
but the narrative is still being pursued, huh?
Sorry?
That narrative of discrimination is still being pursued nonetheless.
Yes, I would imagine. And I mean, the point is, it's somebody's right if they wish to mount that as part of their defense. But you see, you would need to be able to provide the evidence. And I am confident that if you examine the actions of the TTPS over the years, no one can point to any pattern or any, course of conduct which can show any sort of institutionalized discrimination in terms of how they conduct their investigations in relation to one group or another. I think they across the board basically would follow the evidence where it leads. And if you turn out to be Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Baha'i, spiritual, Baptist, whatever, I don't see that ever features in the mix of how they choose to pursue a matter or who they choose to pursue it against. So that's, of course, as I said, someone can make that claim, but to be able to justify it to a court, you would have to come with some serious evidence and statistics to show, well, look, similar persons of different faiths were accused of these things, and the police did nothing. And where are you proving that? If you understand me. So, I think it's the usual hue and cry you hear in such circumstances, and of course, people love to play the victim role, and I mean, it works sometimes. But at the end of the day, if you are talking about moving it forward in a legal manner, then of course you would now need to show the evidence, and that I am quite confident no one will be able to show that evidence as any course of conduct with the TTPS over the years.
One of my concerns is that the police are trying to do their job, and almost at every turn and on multiple levels, every time they do their job or try to do their job, there is a hue and cry. There is some kind of objection, and it's almost as though it undermines, what they're trying to do, and they are dealing with serious matters. How can this be stopped?
Well, I don't think it can be stopped at all, Jessamy, because at the end of the day, the police have to be open and transparent in the way they function, and I think the public has every right to, raise questions, in terms of how things are done. There's nothing wrong with that at all, because you see, greater transparency leads to changes in how things are done. Right? If you remember the Rodney King beating, and all the marches that occurred as a result of that started to bring about changes in police procedure in the U.S. in terms of how they approached, minorities and other different groups, because they were able to show, and that's the point I'm making, they were able to show from the records that there was some sort of systemic, institutionalized, racial prejudice in terms of how the police will function and in terms of how they treated suspects in that way. So therefore, once you are able to do that, then, as I say, you can now make a legal case. But if you don't have that, it still doesn't mean that people can't complain. And I always encourage persons to voice their views. The point is, you remember the words of the Desiderata, they say you must listen even to the dull and ignorant, for they too have their story. So, even though, you may want to dismiss it and say, look, that person doesn't know what they're speaking about, I always say still give them a hearing. You don't have to agree with what they say, but at least, let them voice their opinions. You weigh it, you assess it, and then you put it in the mix as to whether it's something you take on board or whether you reject it. But I see absolutely nothing wrong with persons, voicing their opinions as to how the police conduct their affairs. But of course, if it's not based on any logic, common sense, or practical reasoning, then you just,
I'm just concerned about, these constant challenges. What it's going to mean for the police moving forward, because if they have these challenges, it's an erosion of their image, it's an erosion of the respect that they should be afforded and accorded, and what it's going to mean for their ability to literally do their job. If they're going to be meeting all of this opposition all the time, shouldn't a line be drawn?
Well, the thing is, Jessica, what I would say is that it's incumbent upon the police service to adapt and react and to be proactive in the circumstances. So if it is that you know that you are going to be faced with increasing legal challenges, then it means first thing you need to look at is strengthening your legal team within the police service and strengthening the legal team to which you outsource matters that affect the police service. Then secondly, you ensure that you take a good long hard look at yourself and your procedure and practices. Make sure you codify things. You see, codification and verification are two guidelines that, help to guard against errors and, improper practices. So therefore, and that's what you see in metropolitan cities where, in order to ensure that they avoid errors and you learn from your mistakes. So therefore you say, well, okay, look, we now have a code in terms of how the steps we must take if we encounter this type of situation. So therefore, I think it's a wonderful learning and growth opportunity for the TTPS. And as a result, if they react and if they are proactive in that way, then it would actually lead to greater confidence in the police service, because the public will now have the confidence to say, well, look, hey, we made complaints about these procedures, and look, they have now made adjustments. They have now published what their procedures are in terms of this. So therefore, there's transparency and accountability on all sides. So therefore, the public feels a greater sense of comfort to know that, look, these officers are not operating willy-nilly or at random, but they are following procedure that has been set and established. So I still don't see it as a bad thing. It is part of the growth process. It's part of the learning curve, but we must treat it as such. We must not just dismiss it as idle criticism or, persons trying to obstruct us in our job. It means our job is more challenging, and that's part of life, if you understand me, and that's part of growth in any scenario. But it means that we must rise to that challenge by making the necessary adjustments.
How would some of the claims of physical brutality, Mr. George, feature in this situation? Because the AG is saying that if in fact that does come up, the government is quite prepared. He says, we will take it we'll take it there whether there was reasonable suspicion in detaining someone. It is not new for the court. These are easy matters for a court to decide upon. Because one of the fathers of one of the detainees, Shamoon or Mohammed, is saying that the family is thinking of taking this matter to the court because there was suspicion of physical brutality.
Okay, well, the thing is, to be able to proceed through the courts and to be able to proceed with some level of success, it has to be more than a suspicion. You would need to actually have the evidence to show that there was the use of excessive force by the police in the circumstance.
Like a doctor's certificate or something like that?
If it is that they do have that evidence, then I think that's what the AG is speaking of in terms of those matters. Yes, we have enough precedents and authorities to show clearly that the courts will always rule against any use of excessive force which results in brutality and physical damage to someone in circumstances where there was absolutely no justification for it. So maybe that's what the Attorney General is referring to when he says yes, those are easy matters to decide. But the point is, the fundamental underpinning of it all must be the evidence of the use of excessive force. And I'll just bring this to bear in terms of current scenarios internationally. Right? We had the Parkland shooting of the 17 persons recently. And, in Trinidad and Tobago, we did have a school shooting incident some years back at the international school. I'm sure you all remember that. And where this young man who was claimed to be also a troubled young man went into the school with a firearm and, started shooting at people and stuff like that. And then there was a hostage situation which ensued. and the police were called, and he barricaded himself in a classroom and started shooting at the police through the door of the classroom, and the police returned fire with their automatic weapons, and he was killed as a result. Now, interestingly enough, following that scenario, the boy's family made complaints and representations and stuff like that, and charges were sought to be instituted against the police officers for using excessive force in the circumstance, and I defended the two police officers, and ultimately they were cleared of all wrongdoing in that scenario. But the thing is, that was something where you had to consider whether it was excessive force to use your automatic weapon in response to a threat of someone shooting at you, where you had this is a school, this was at the international school, a school full of children, so therefore in those circumstances we were able to show and justify that, look, the police did not act unreasonably in returning fire in those circumstances. So you always weigh each situation on its merits to determine whether there was excessive force. So to bring it back to the question of, the persons who were detained during the carnival period, if it is that they can prove by evidence, but as I say, it's something you must always be able to prove. It's not just a matter of you claiming that you were beaten or, brutalized. You have to be able to prove it to the court to show that, look, yes, this indeed happened.
And that's the thing, isn't it? It's the burden of proof, as it were. And also, as you described there, that the police needed to have that reasonable suspicion that they would be meeting a particular kind of thing. There were complaints of people's homes, doors being broken down, furniture and belongings being smashed, and so on and so forth. And I'm just thinking, if the police have a suspicion that the people that they're coming up against are going to respond in a particularly violent manner, then they're going to go in hard. They're going to go in on the offensive. They're going to go in aggressively.
Right, but you see, the thing is, I think that is something that we definitely need to look at in Trinidad and Tobago, and I'll tell you why. From what I have been able to observe over the years, there doesn't seem to be any consistent pattern in terms of the approach of police officers in these scenarios. And, I mean, if at all you could glean any consistency, I think, unfortunately, it errs on the use of excessive force when trying to enter premises in those circumstances. And I'm not sure it's always necessary, because as you quite rightly pointed out, Jessime, it would really depend on what you are expecting to meet. If it is that you have credible information that, look, this person is armed and dangerous and they are within this house, and, there's the possibility that they may, exchange fire,
yes,
then that's a different scenario. But if it is that people are home in their houses sleeping, and you have absolutely no information to justify that, then I don't understand why the first option often seems to be that they must charge in, break down your door, and carry on in this, unfortunately totally brutal manner, where you are already, the persons are already outnumbered, they're already outgunned, they're outmanned, they're out everything.
Absolutely.
They're waking up drowsy, sleepy, and, the harshness and brutality I've seen. I mean, sometimes you see people, who film it and they put it on social media, and you wonder, is there some procedure that our police officers are following, or is it that they just carry out these procedures at random? In other words, is there codification? And that's my point there. And you see, that's where our police service needs to get up to speed. In other words, you need to have your code in terms of saying, well, okay, look, if this is the circumstance, if there's no credible threat or no credible information to suggest that, look, you are going to be met with resistance in terms of either gunfire or an attack or so, then you don't seek to, as your first step, to break down the people's door. Most persons, basically, in such a circumstance, they will be terrified, intimidated. They say, open the door. Yes. They would comply. If it is that someone is given obvious resistance, then okay, that's a different scenario. But at least try to, approach it humanely first, instead of the brute force as your first option. And that's where I have a difficulty with, some of the actions of our police officers.
The AG is saying law enforcement was well within their rights to take actions as they see fit. Who determines that? The police officer who is leading the charge?
The challenge, the court will determine if it was fit and proper, to act in the way you did. And you would have to justify that, as I say, by the credible nature of the information or evidence you had as to the level of threat you were expecting. So, in other words, he's correct when he says as they see fit.
Yes.
But the point is, it's not the police to determine as they see fit. It's the law that will determine as they see fit.
One of my concerns now is an increasing hypervigilance among our law enforcement officials and security personnel. And especially in light of revelations that would have been made by the head of the National Security Council, Prime Minister Dr. Rowley, as well as, what he would have released in Parliament on Friday. And not only hypervigilance among our security personnel, but also among us ordinary citizens. It's as though we woke up and found ourselves down the rabbit hole, like Alice in Wonderland.
You need to clarify a bit more, Jesse.
Okay. In other words, this kind of thing.
Statement by the Prime Minister. What statement in particular?
That there is at least one ISIS cell in Trinidad and so on and so forth. This is the kind of thing that you expect to happen in other countries, but now this reality is here with us in Trinidad and Tobago. We can no longer bury our heads in the sand, as it were. There are those who refuse to believe it and say they're just using that as fake news to distract people. But for many other people, they've gone into a state of hypervigilance, and with hypervigilance comes suspicion, itchy trigger, fingers, and so on.
The thing is, of course, I would not at all assume to have the information that the Prime Minister has in terms of this matter. But the thing is, I think even in a statement such as that, I would not necessarily think that you would issue a statement such as that without there being some sort of concurrent either charges or arrests which could justify what you are saying. Because, it's a very dramatic and grandiose statement.
Absolutely.
But the thing is, the skepticism of the public is going to be fueled if you say, well, okay, so you have that information, and who have you charged as a result? If you have nobody charged, then it makes it sound hollow, and then it makes it, open to all the questions and all the speculation and all the, suspicion that, look, you probably just making this up. So, look at how Robert Mueller has done it differently in the U.S., where in terms of the investigation, in terms of the Russian meddling, the announcement that was made by the Deputy Attorney General of the U.S., it was made when they had the indictments. They had charges laid. So in other words, you are able to back it up, and then when you peruse those indictments, you see tons and tons of credible, verifiable information and evidence upon which they based it. So you don't just come and make these statements that sound dramatic and grandiose, and you have no evidence to support it. And again, that's sometimes a failing, I think, of our security services generally in Trinidad and Tobago. You hear them make these grand pronouncements, but the point is, then they say, well, we can't tell you on what evidence it's based. That's poppycock. That's you're talking about like 1960s and 1950s type of law enforcement. Nobody does that kind of thing anymore. If you are reaching the point of actually being able to make that public pronouncement, the only way you can really justifiably and credibly do so is if you have already gathered your evidence, gathered your information, you've measured it up against the law, you've checked the legislation, you've been able to lay charges, and then you make such an announcement. And then now the public will not be able to question you or, to make idle speculation that, well, you all are just saying that because you would have it backed by the charges. So that's the concern I have with, that type of announcement being made. It sounds dramatic and, yes, you make it sound like a bombshell you're dropping, but the point is it's an empty and hollow bombshell if it's not backed by you being able to produce to the public the justification in terms of either charges, or, which can now substantiate the claims that are being made.
So, Mr. George, now in 2018, what would you say would be procedure for a police officer? He or she has charged someone or in the process of doing that sort of thing with some kind of infraction of the law, as the case might be. She would write up the report, lodge it in the police station where it is supposed to be lodged, and she also decides, but let me put that also on social media, as the case might be.
Right. So again, you have the question of, as I say, codification. Is there a code of conduct which guides police officers in terms of these things? Now, the point is, generally, you have the basic law which says that police officers are not supposed to give press conferences or see public statements, especially in relation to something like that. But the point is, have we updated things to deal with the question of social media postings and that type of thing? You recall not too long ago, a police officer was alleged to have posted pictures of herself in her uniform, in some very salacious and seductive poses, and so the thing is, that's why I say the challenge really is that the police service has to adapt. Mm-hmm. They have to take the lead and they have to be proactive. They can't bury their heads in the sand and say, well, look, we have standing orders, regulations from 1966 or 1950. You didn't have social media then. So you now have to ensure that, look, you issue your new codes of conduct which now deal with all these new scenarios. And I don't know if they are keeping up to date or up to pace in that regard.
We've got a couple text messages. One person saying, all over the world, ISIS is showing its ugly head. May heaven help us all. And I guess this is in response to the fact that ISIS allegedly claimed responsibility for the attempted destabilization plot. Another, is there one law for the rich and another for the poor? For example, the African men during the state of emergency under the People's Partnership who were locked up. Now the Muslims in Trinidad are the untouchables. Any comment? Any clarification you want to make on both of those?
Aspect, I'm not sure I see the correlation at all, because I know for sure, in fact, some of those who were detained during that state of emergency under the last regime, some of them have actually filed legal action and have succeeded and have been awarded damages. So I am not sure where that question is going.
Okay.
So I would leave that there. Thank you.
Okay. Can we just squeeze in one or two calls very quickly?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Let's go to the phone lines. Good morning. You're on the air. Hello.
A very good morning to you, Jesse. A very good morning to you, Mr. Carr, and a very warm welcome back.
Thank you very much,
Mr. George, good morning.
Hi, good morning to you, sir.
Mr. George, if the credibility of the information was corroborated by a reliable source, does the authority have to divulge by whom the information was corroborated? Thank you.
Well, as I said before, it would only be relevant in terms of legal proceedings if it is that persons bring action and say, well, look, the steps you took to arrest me were unjustified. So as I say, at that point, the police will have to provide some sort of proof to the court to show that, look, this wasn't just an arbitrary or capricious exercise. We did have some credible information. As I say, as to how much they want to reveal at that stage, it's a fine line they have to walk in terms of revealing enough to ensure that the court understands and is able to accept that, look, you did have some credible basis, and not revealing too much so as to compromise the sources of your information. So it's really a decision you have to take in terms of how much you do reveal. But certainly, if there's legal action, you'd want to ensure you put forth enough information that a court can accept it as reasonable.
All right, just another call. I'll squeeze in very quickly. Hello, you're on the air on Sky. Hello.
Hello, morning, Jesse. Morning, Mr. Carr.
Morning, Vancouver.
Yes, well, now that the ISIS people have claimed some sort of responsibility for the plot to destabilize the carnival season and the country as a whole, I don't think it can be classified as a threat by individuals. Myself or Mr. Martin George or myself or Mr. Edison Carr making a plot individually or collectively to destabilize. It has now come from an insurgency group, and it has to be treated differently. I don't think it's a question of the police, but it's a question of a joint army-police operation. Then, if that was the case, I don't believe that we would have been having this conversation now. The army would have had the intelligence to move in and to do searches, probably to defuse bombs or whatever other apparatus were being used so as to defuse. Now, the point is that Mr. George is quoting the legal ramifications of this exercise, but I don't think that that should be a question to consider. The police had information. As I said, I would have used the army police, and there would not have been any question of legality or illegality regarding these searches. That's all.
Thanks very much. Martin George, your thoughts?
Okay, well, in terms of what that caller just suggested, first thing we have to understand or appreciate the fact that some group claims responsibility doesn't mean that they are responsible. Mm-hmm. Any idiot could call in and say, I am responsible. You have prank calls and hoax calls all the time. So I don't see that is a basis to then go forth and launch the argument that caller has put forth. It makes absolutely no sense. You must have some evidence to be able to support their claim. If there is no evidence, then any idiot could call and say, look, I am the one responsible for ABC. You have persons who confess to things all the time and they have absolutely no connection with it. And the point is, it's a good tactic if you are a terror organization to claim
absolutely
everything is your work. Then it makes it seem as if you are everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Mm-hmm. So I can't see that as the launch pad at all. To go down, as Jesse May used the analogy, the rabbit hole that caller, just went down, and I would respectfully decline to follow him down there.
All right. Final call. Good morning. You're on the air. Hello.
Jesse, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Kamuto.
Edison,
Kamuto.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Mr. George, good morning.
Good morning to you, sir.
Now, what I'm looking at here is the innocent worshippers of Islam are looking at the little intimidation by the police. How do you look at these things?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Well, the thing
Thanks
is,
very much.
what I have always said, and I take your point fully,
yes.
The innocent worshippers of Islam, they need to come out and make their voices heard more to the extremist terrorists who use Islam and the cover of the religion to carry out the most horrific acts on humanity. And if you look at the statistics worldwide, and I don't know if this is something that people keep missing, the majority of victims of extremist Islamic violence are Muslims. They carry out the majority of their attacks against Muslims. So, I don't know why we even are having these types of discussions when, as this caller quite rightly pointed out, the innocent Islamic worshippers and the innocent Muslims, they are not making their voices heard loudly enough. I mean, I was heartened to see here in this present scenario some of our leading Islamic persons come forth and they spoke very, rationally, and, they spoke credibly, and they spoke in the support of, law and order and that type of thing. But the thing is, they need to do more of that and keep the pedal to the metal in that regard to ensure that they don't get tainted by the zealots and extremists who use the cover of their religion to carry out their atrocities.
Mr. George, is there anything in the law as far as compensation is concerned? If a member of the public feel that they have been grievously injured, as the case might be, and it was found that the authorities used excessive force over and beyond the call of duty, as the case might be, when a judge awards compensation, it is only the state, really the taxpayer, who pays this. Should at a time come that the authority who has been found guilty should also pay part of that compensation?
Well, actually, it's something that is very interesting, and we had a recent judgment of Justice Kokaram last year, where he was very creative, and he indicated that he was of the view that the officers who are responsible ought to start to be held accountable. I think Justice Sipasad, who is one of our more forward-thinking and innovative judges, he has also voiced similar opinions. I think Justice Budu Singh has also started voicing those opinions, because at the end of the day, these judges, they sit and they see that, as you quite rightly say, the state ends up being the one who has to bear the burden all the time.
Yes.
So the thing is, we have to adapt.
Yes.
Again, it comes back to that. We have to start adapting the scenario whereby you start to involve some sort of level of personal accountability in terms of how you look at the scenario, and you say, well, look, this ought not to continue to be a burden on the taxpayers for the actions of errant or rogue officers who decide to step out of the bounds of what their code of conduct ought to be. But again, you see, it comes back now to the police being able to show that they have clearly identifiable and codified, steps to show, well, look, you were supposed to do A, B, C, instead you did D, F, G. So therefore, clearly you, the officer, are wrong. So therefore, we are now going to seek to make you, the officer, personally liable in that sense. But as I say, if you don't codify it, then you can't blame the officer, because then it may be an error of judgment on his part, but it's not breach of a specific code. So that's why the codification that I speak of is so necessary for our police service at this time. And if you look at, and it's not something that you have to reinvent the wheel, If you look at how these things are handled in terms of developed countries, how they manage their police services, all of the things there, you just take from them and you adapt it to our scenario. You say, well, okay, look, these first three paragraphs, they're good. The next four, we don't need that because that doesn't apply to our scenario. And you create your own code. You could do that in less than a month. You could codify most of the aspects whereby you now have set procedures as to how officers are supposed to react in a situation. So therefore, you now eliminate the suspicion and the arbitrariness in terms of, Officer John might deal with it in a nice way. Officer Brown might deal with it in a rough and, so therefore you eliminate that by having a standard code of conduct and operational manual so that they can all know, well, hey, these are the steps we ought to take. So therefore, if someone does not take a certain step, then you can point to the manual and say, why didn't you do that? Isn't that there? That's something we're supposed to do. I remember I was in South Africa a couple of years ago at a International Crime Stoppers conference. And they had an issue in South Africa where police officers were abusing the use of the sirens. They found out that police officers were using the sirens when they went to pick up their children from school, using the police vehicles when they wanted to go to lunch, all sorts of things. So every 5 minutes, a siren is going off and somebody's in some supposed emergency. And you know how they stopped that? Codifying it. They said, okay, all right, you are allowed to use your siren under these circumstances. And they set out a list of things, right? And of course, they catered for impromptu scenarios that may occur. If the impromptu scenario occurs, then you must do this. You must log what is the situation you're responding to. You must call it in. So in other words, if you don't follow those steps, then why did you use the siren? And then they now install a monitor on the vehicles to check every time the siren is used. Then they check back the timeline. Okay, did Officer Harris call in to say he had an emergency situation here? No. So then now you can hold him accountable. And that cut the illegal use of the siren down to zero. So therefore, everybody now was following a code, and that's what we need to start doing for our TTPS here.
Martin George, just want to let you and everyone know, apparently the gentleman who is alleged and believed to have murdered the prisons officer a couple of weeks ago, he is said to have been killed in a shootout with police at Calvary Hill, Port of Spain, a couple hours ago. And right now, people in that area are staging a fiery protest in the street. So just wanted to give that piece of information there as we bring the discussion to a close. So the police trying to do their job, and the response is fiery protest and rioting.
I often wonder, Jessamy, and I mean, of course, it may just be idle speculation on my part, but I often wonder, these persons who always seem to come out for these fiery protests in these scenarios, aren't they late for work? Aren't they late for school? How do they think of all this time to mount these protests at the drop of a hat? And I often wonder, in terms of other issues, why don't we see them protesting to say, well, okay, look, we want better educational facilities for our community. We want better sporting facilities for, so,
yes.
I mean, it's not at all to diminish the value or the legitimacy of their protest, but I just sometimes wonder if it's not
misplaced,
always one-sided, and, it always seems to be for purposes that are not always for the upliftment and betterment of the community.
And sometimes where the community leaders themselves are implicated, there are no demonstrations.
This is the point, and, to bring that scenario full circle, if you recall the situation in Jamaica a couple of years ago,
with Dudu
when they wanted to arrest Dudu, you remember, communities banded together to ensure that the police must not arrest Dudus, because Dudus was the godfather for all of them. He was, the man spreading the largesse around, and it took them months to eventually get Dudus. And remember, it was a pastor who was eventually implicated in trying to help Dudus escape, dressed as a woman, So
the irony.
It's interesting. It's an interesting social study to wonder why it is that you have persons rallying and protesting for these things, but sometimes for other issues, which I think are also equally beneficial to the community, you hardly see them coming out and protesting for those things.
The irony is that those very same communities do need the police to do their jobs in those communities from time to time.
That's correct. And the thing is, there are many very good, very decent, very law-abiding persons within those communities.
Absolutely.
But again, in the same scenario as we drew earlier, in terms of, the religious extremists, you may have a few bad apples who taint the image of the entire group as a result of their action.
Martin George, thank you for giving us some time this morning. It was wonderful, as usual, the classroom session that we had with you.
And Mr. Edison and the Dr.
All right. And we've been chatting with Martin George, attorney at law and member of the Police Service Commission, on the Breakfast Roundtable here on Sky.
Edison Carr, Jessie May Venture, and Dr. Wayne Haywood on the Breakfast Roundtable on Sky 99.5 FM.